Okay, so everyone, welcome to another broadcast of the North Carolina Masonic Research Society, and we are thrilled to have back worshipful brother Robert Johnson. Robert is a past master and current secretary of Waukegan Lodge number 78, a member of the York Rite and Scottish Rite, host of the Whence Came You podcast, managing editor of the Midnight Freemason blog, co-author of It's Business Time, adapting a corporate path for Freemasonry, and co-host of the Masonic Roundtable. So RJ stays very, very busy, but does a lot for the craft, and it's really, really greatly appreciated. And RJ, we're just coming off of the Mid-Atlantic Esotericon this past Saturday, which was absolutely fantastic, and you knocked it out of the ballpark as usual. So kudos there. Great job. And with that, I'm going to mute everyone except for RJ. RJ, I'm going to make you co-host so that you can feel free to share your screen. And okay, you are now co-host. Congratulations. So whenever you're ready, the floor is yours.
All right. Well, thanks very much. Sorry. Yeah. So I keep going to grab my glasses sometimes. Sorry. Bad old habits. Anyway, this presentation is it's called Apotheosis and Quantum Entanglement. It is kind of it's the third part in a series of lectures that I give. If you were at Mid-Atlantic Esotericon and you watched my presentation there, some of those concepts that I talk about there lightly are mentioned in more detail here, and vice versa, because really the three-part series really kind of culminates in this other presentation that I do also, which I did for the Mid-Atlantic Esotericon. And I didn't plan it that way. It was just something that I had put together, and I hope everybody enjoyed it. So you'll hear some things that are similar to what I talked about there, but in this presentation, it goes over a little bit more in depth on some of the concepts. And so I'll go ahead and share my screen and get started here. Let's see, I'll just share my desktop so you all can see everything. And we'll go to Chrome and we'll go to play. Present. So again, Apotheosis and Quantum Entanglement, Legend, Philosophy, Fact. I have finals tomorrow for a class I have, so it's business stuff. So if I, slowly go away from philosophy and religious concepts and filter into the benefits of capitalism and why communism sucks, sorry. But so here is some I threw up some graphics here to give you guys a little bit of imagery here. Lower left, Benno bird. On the right is a phoenix. Upper right, this kind of new agey, I don't know, image of a man, going through the process of apotheosis, becoming, man to God. And of course, a really, I guess, familiar image that probably most of the world is familiar with, right? Jesus ascending. So just to give a quick overview on some of this, the first one I did was Esoterics 101. Esoterics 101 really goes over a few elements, just a few. But in summation, we talk about how all religions lead to the same truth. Wisdom schools teach this truth without dogma. So without, man-made rules and things, through Renaissance, Enlightenment, you have Rosicrucianism, Freemasonry, OTO, Hermetic Order, Golden Dawn. All these kind of groups really tied a lot of stuff together. It's like a wagon wheel of truth, right? Everything leads to the center. Things are taught through allegory due to mindful interpretation. So with these groups, these different groups teach through allegory and stories with purpose and telling you that these are allegories and stories, unlike maybe per se something like a revealed religion, which might say, this is a fact, take this literally, yada, yada, yada. So we explore archetypes and how a lot of them are the same, religions and wisdom schools, and how they utilize the transmission of a core secret, which is almost always related to the word, but the word as kind of a catch-all meaning for something deeper. And this all revolves around the body, like example with Freemasonry, Solomon's Temple being the body. Within Hebrew, if we apply the tetractys to the word, we see the word is equal in gematria to 72, the pentagram, which is 5 angles of 72 degrees, which equals 360, which is a symbol for God or a circle. So that's what you missed in part 1. Part 2 really deals with revelations in relation to the word. So we established that the word is kind of a twofold thing. It is an ancient way of explaining the nature of existence. We talk about the science, how sound can destroy, Newton's third law of opposites. We have something that we go into, a little bit about string theory, that the Big Bang and the hard spark may be very similar in nature. We talk about the smallest element of nature, which we call the strings or quarks, and the idea of a reverberating sound or the word. So an opposite would be sound can destroy, can it create? Can it create via a word? So that word as written in Hebrew might not be a word at all, but grammatically we look at it as an action. So in actual Hebrew it is I will be that which I will be, which is showing an attribute of what it will do or become, rather than saying this is my name. And could possibly be, right, the alluding to a divine secret of the divinity within man. So getting into apotheosis, this is a really, I don't want to say really long presentation, right, but it is long. So I do fly through some slides, and I will skip some slides at the very end, but those slides will be available to you. Send me an email, and I'll send you what you need. But to get into this, apotheosis essentially is this idea of becoming, and is a reintegration, which is kind of a Gnostic concept. If you're familiar with George Washington, the apotheosis of Washington, the lesser known apotheosis of Abraham Lincoln, those kind of concepts. This is the idea of apotheosis, man becoming God. But if we look at it maybe a little bit deeper, like the word religion is really related to the idea grammatically as reintegration. So it's a literal reconnect. This is a Gnostic idea, not in origin. However, one moment. Sorry about that. The dangers of home presenting, kids and all that. Anyway, so getting back to this Gnostic idea, not in origin. The Gnostics didn't invent the idea of apotheosis or going back to the one, but they do use the idea in some of their, well, most of their writings. And as we know, Gnostic Christianity really has a foundation that comes about, hundreds of years after the death of Jesus. But if you've ever read a book, Bart Ehrman writes a book about the Gospel of Judas Iscariot. And in this particular book, it is the Gospel of Judas, the betrayer, right? And it's a Gnostic text that paints Judas as the hero, because Jesus tells Judas, you are the man that will sacrifice the man that clothes me. So this is an idea that Jesus comes from the one and is not a product of the lesser God, which he calls Yaldabaoth or Yaldabaoth or Yahweh, Lord of the Sabbath. So in fact, in one instance in the text, Jesus laughs at the disciples because they're praying in Passover. And he laughs at them and says, "You're praying to the wrong God. You're praying to this lesser deity." And the idea of the lesser deity is that there has to be a way to explain the bad in the world, right? A perfect God would never create the bad. So the Gnostic Christian idea is to have a form, a Platonic form, even if you want to call it that, of a lesser God who is responsible for the world. And so in this particular text, when Jesus dies, he is being sacrificed as a human so that the soul can return to the pleroma, or the realm, to be one again with the singular consciousness. So moving on to kind of the scientific version of possibly of how this happens in the world of science and physics. This is quantum entanglement. So at the moment of the Big Bang, all matter is created at once, and because of this, it's permanently linked in a way. And this gives us possible clues to reality. So in this image here that you just pull from online or whatever to kind of explain the Big Bang, I'm going to try to use, maybe I'm not going to try to use, I was going to use like a laser pointer effect here, but on the left-hand side is where this origin comes from. It's this quantum fluctuation, which really deals with what David Bohm might call the implicate order, or others might call flux point, or the omega point. This is where quantum potential comes from. And what quantum potential is, think of it like an infinite pool of everything that could ever happen in any particular way. So everything is contained there, and then what is manifested, moves throughout. And how does it move throughout? Well, this is by no means an original idea of mine. This image I created, of course, I laid it on top, but has been drawn in other places. But the idea here is that the Kabbalistic tree of life, moving left to right, if this doesn't mirror my screen, the left side is essentially this limitless light, the God portion, crown chakra, all that, moving down to Malkuth, the furthest away from the originating light. And so the idea here is that it's perhaps the Kabbalistic tree of life also gives us a clue to the Big Bang, which in the Zohar, it talks about the hard spark, which is also interesting. A text so old is referencing a scientific concept that is relatively new. But this expansion of the Big Bang is 13.77 billion years in the making. So it's still expanding. So essentially, there are a ton of amazing concepts contained within quantum entanglement. But what it really means is that at the moment of creation, all matter that exists, that comes into existence, boom, everything is here, right? And all the matter comes out. And it comes out from this area of quantum fluctuation or flux point or whatever you want to call it. We'll call it implicate order because I'm a fan of David Bohm. But from that point, all the matter is connected. So all the matter in the universe is the same age. And because of some other scientific concepts like thermodynamics, nothing ever goes away. You guys are familiar with liquid, solid, gas. Well, it's the same thing. So all matter, the desk that you're sitting at or the computer that you're sitting with is made of atoms that are as old as the atoms that are in your body. And so that trips some people out. But this is not by any means science fiction. So because of this interconnectedness, gives us some additional clues. So this slide is just telling me to remind you that I'm going to talk about physics and theology. And physics is a broad term for anything scientific, and theology is a broad term for anything that I would call religious, philosophical, or otherwise. So in theology, we have to ask a few questions because I want to address maybe the artificial contention that exists between these two paths, religion and science, or theology and physics, or whatever you want to say. So in doing so, we ask a few questions. And one of the ones that I think is interesting is this idea that given our ability for finding, deciphering, and analyzing critically, and what I mean is you go to school and you learn to critically analyze and think about texts. And we necessarily look at things and we look at them and we take them apart and we figure them out as best as we can. And yet, we do not apply the same logic to our religious mythologies. And this is really interesting to me. We try through a process called exegesis, right? But exegesis is still working within the construct of a system. So it's not truly objective. It's still subjective in nature. So I ask, how do we believe parts that we know are patently false, right? It's like, for instance, right? It is highly unlikely that Jesus, we know he lived historically, absolutely, but it's highly unlikely that he had a one-on-one conversation with the man who gave him his sentence, right? So semantics or not, like, there may be more to the story and some other part of it or whatever, but we know that probably didn't happen, right? So we have to ask ourselves some of these questions. Why do we conceptualize allegories as factual historical happenings all the time? There are tons of amazing religious texts out there, but so much of them is telling us a story to convey a specific message, which is the way we did it historically. We look at ancient religions of man, and this is what we do. We didn't, histories weren't really a thing until very recently, in the grand scheme of things. So what's our fascination with literalizing everything? And then also, why do we carve out science? There's this constant thing. I had a teacher once, a spiritual teacher rather, I said, I think this is this in science. And he says, whoa, this is the realm of the ineffable. It's not really cool to try to explain it. And after that conversation, we had an agreement that I was probably not okay to be the student of his anymore. This was just a natural path of things, but my questions led a little farther than I think he was ready to take those things, or that particular path doesn't do that, right? They don't try to explain certain things that are considered ineffable. So, but why do we carve out the science? Why do we say it's not okay to do explain something religiously as a scientific principle? Is it not okay to say that the Zohar talking about the hard spark could possibly be the Big Bang, or that the Word is the literal emanation of the Big Bang, or what? But physics also kind of does the same thing, or science. I would have asked, why do scientists feel that there's no value in world religions? And this probably would have been asked 20 years ago, but in recent times we find that science really doesn't do that anymore. I mean, we have some sticklers who like to get up there and rally against all things religion, but what we find is that they still tie themselves to these classic philosophers who by chance are still people like Isaac Newton or whatever, right? And they still tie themselves to these highly philosophical people. And ultimately, science is an attempt at not destroying the ineffable, but trying to decipher it in a way that makes sense to us through the human experience. Every religion on the planet has allusions and allegories that explain scientific concepts, right? Like I mentioned, with the Zohar and whatnot. But we seem to be too caught up believing the story than analyzing and recognizing what it is. And so we have science who dismisses religion and religion that dismisses science. And that's really a shame. So the other concept that science has in common with religion is the idea of a life after death. Thermodynamics really tells us that, something happens and you continue to exist, although we don't know what. Only our religions and philosophies tend to be so bold, as maybe even audacious, I might say, to tell us what happens next. Thermodynamics has the idea of entropy, which again is kind of the concept that allows life after death in a scientific sense. So life after death and apotheosis, immortality. So in this particular portion, I want to talk a little bit about some of the legends contained within some of the more popular world religions. And by no means am I leaving somebody out because of a dislike of it or anything. I just picked some really interesting ones that tend to have some great examples, particularly of the idea of life after death in terms of immortality. So first step, Hinduism. Hinduism, the idea of the samsara, which is like a divine soul belonging to another realm that moves into a physical realm many times in order to increase experience for enlightenment and gain karma. We keep coming back until we're done. My current teacher, right? Like, if I'm being honest, I'll be totally weird with you. I think he's about there. I don't know that he's coming back, right? If I could be so bold, right? But this is the idea. A really wise person. Jainism is another one. So very much the same, especially in some of the earlier texts. We have the idea of an eternal soul moving into another body. Buddhism, which is about 2,500 years old. This is probably one of the most scientific versions of this idea, and it just blows my mind. They even have a word for it, metempsychosis, which essentially says you don't always come back as a person. So you might come back as a blade of grass, or a dog, or a worm, or a psychopathic human. Who knows? But what's really amazing is actually they have like stipulations for this. So it takes 49 days and 2 years to come back. This is just fascinating stuff. So where it comes from in some classical sources. So when we look at when I say classic, don't think older, think probably more westernized. So for instance, we have stories that stem from Greece in the way of Dionysus and Zagreus and Persephone and these kind of Grecian legends, which talk about a child that's born out of wedlock, in terms of Zeus has a kid with another woman, and the baby is born, and Hera is enraged, and the Titans are enraged, and the Titans attempt to murder and eat the child, to destroy it. And this is a time before humans. And so in all of these legends, it's very similar. And they're in a linear type of format. So what I mean is, it first happens to Zagreus. He's born, and he's ripped apart and eaten by the Titans. And then Zeus throws a lightning bolt down. He's enraged and destroys everything. And one of the gods basically picks up Zagreus's heart and brings it back to Zeus, and he like puts it in his leg of all places, where it grows again, and it starts to cycle over again, where the same thing tends to continue to happen, where it's destroyed and recreated, this being, right, Zagreus and Dionysus. And through this, through the ash that is left on the ground, right? The ash that's on the ground from this lightning bolt when Zeus kills everybody is part Titan, part Zagreus or Dionysus. And so man is born from these ashes, part divine, part not. And so this is an example of the wheel of creation and perhaps even cyclical time. You know, in paganism, not all of it, but some people like Julius Caesar wrote about certain pagan practices by Celtics and Druids believing in the transmigration of souls. This is the recycling of the body, essentially, which is the same as of souls. So really interesting. And then in Taoism, we have immortality referred to in Taoism is really a physical immortality that's brought about through the channeling of energies and harmonies by directing natural forces in the body, creating more durable body materials, using techniques like breathing, focusing sexual energies, all these things that lead to a literal form of immortality. And just a note that the idea of spiritual immortality, right? So we're talking about physical immortality here. The idea of a spiritual immortality like that of Christianity really was alien to the Chinese until Buddhism comes along, which is introduced later to China. So where it comes from, mainstream sources. Mainstream is in quotes because mainstream, in this case, I'm going to be talking about Christianity, early Christianity. And this is one of the more difficult parts of where we get some elements of reincarnation in early Christianity. So according to the first important father of the early Orthodox Church, Origen, he says that the soul exists before birth. And this is a really interesting concept. So he suggests this because he says there's an argument for a pre-existence which is found in Hebrew scriptures and the teachings of Jesus. Something to think about, you know, throughout this presentation, I might say something like thought experiment. So thought experiment is many times, you know, I've got 4 kids and they're all under 13. And sometimes they say things like, it kind of feels like, Dad, we're not real. Or they'll say things like, what's death? What's it like when you die? And I have to say, well, nobody really knows. And they say, well, are you scared of it? And they say, yeah, I'm kind of scared of it. And I say, well, is it scary to think about where you were before? And they say, well, what do you mean? And I say, well, where were you before you were here? And they say, well, I was in Mom's tummy. And I say, and where were you before that? You know, my daughter says she was eating ice cream, which is really cute. But the point is, it's not so much scary. So that's my question for you. It's first thought experiment. Origen says, a pre-existence. Where were you before? So, and do you go back there? And when you're done, is this the one consciousness? So getting back to what Origen had said, he says that specifically we learn of some early exegesis from Clement of Alexandria, who's a direct disciple of the Apostle Peter. He ascribes instances in the texts of John where Jesus talks about what is to come, and he refers to those who started changes in society. And he says, you know, these changes in society have come about now, but you did them. And he's not saying that you did them. He's saying, like, you did them, and what Clement is saying about this is, you did them like previous to this existence, previous to this manifestation. And then later on, we find something further. Clement says that when Moses talks to his people, he says that future events will be caused and carried out by you. And in the context of the text, he's saying that your future manifestations will do this. He's not saying like you're going to do this later. And they know this because of the way he's talking about it and how he talked in previous passages. So it's decidedly different. So here we have some, early Christian references to reincarnation ideas. And then we'll move on to later Christianity through Paul, which is interesting, right? Because this is where we are really today. So Paul, Saul of Tarsus, he preaches immortality through a spiritual existence, and you get this immortality of a spiritual way by accepting Jesus Christ as your Savior. So adherence to a system. This is what he offers. This is very different. So this is the accepting. He says that through attempting to live a clean life and through grace and altruism, the teachings of Jesus. So he offers this new way of immortality. So your immortality here in this is this idea of life in heaven. And when I was like 10 years old, I seem to I grew up in a Roman Catholic house, surrounded by all of my my Italian aunts and uncles, and everything is taken so literal, even though Roman Catholicism is very mystical. I'm not sure that they ever truly got it, or maybe they just didn't talk about it, or it was too deep for them, or whatever. But my idea heaven as a kid was like, oh, cool, I get to drive around in a convertible with my friends, and I'm drinking Coca-Colas all day long and eating pixie sticks or whatever. Is this heaven? But no, this is the idea. So contextually, paradise is defined in the text as oneness with God, and hell is defined as this idea of eternity without God, an eternal separation. And somewhere along the way, we literalize Dante's Inferno as this fire and brimstone preaching stuff. And this is just not what the text says or ever said. It's a later thing that got popularized, and you scare people with it. And I think this is just really, really interesting. I have a note here to talk a little bit about this idea that some of these. I have this bullet that it's a reward, right? So it's kind of I don't mean this disrespectfully, because not at all. I'm just saying that the idea of a reward system, that you are rewarded with something rather than just being. How good can you be if you did it for something? This is the idea. And certainly Gnostics appreciated this idea as well. And the idea that the note I have here to mention is that in our current exegesis of Christian and other religious texts, we often look back at the context that these things were written, and we say, this is what they had to have meant. It says in this text this, and we have all these parallel readings. And so we've got the same things written by several different people around the same times. And then we look at them all and see the similarities, and we say, that must be real. This is removed, this isn't right, or whatever. But the point is that some early church exegesis is done by the Gnostics, and they did it at a time that was much closer to the time when Jesus lived and the things were written. So did they understand it better than we do today? I don't know. Just a thought experiment again. And if they did understand it better, then do we place more weight on what they said than what we say today? So that's some of the ideas of how religion brings up the idea of the samsara, or the wheel of lives, and reincarnation and immortality, living forever. But what about science? So noetic science really made popular from the book The Lost Symbol. If you know Edgar Mitchell, a popular astronaut who had an out-of-body experience and came back home and founded some really interesting organizations. Things that studied these really interesting connections between people and life after death and things. So popular concepts are like examining weight after death, the popular 21 grams experiment where somebody has died, and before they die, they weigh this much, and after they die, they weigh 21 grams less. Now, there was a popular experiment. The results are kind of dubious based on the scientific method used. However, and to my knowledge, it's never been repeated, but nonetheless, it made its way into a popular movie, 21 Grams, which, again, barely a reason to mention the film other than to talk about a connection story that deals with donors, like organ donating and whatnot. And the same goes for movies like 7 Pounds with Will Smith, where you achieve some notion of I would call it intrinsic ideas of understanding what it means to continue to live. You know, we tend to think about living forever in these ideas today scientifically as organ donation, or living on through what we'll call legacies. But we fail to take it farther sometimes. They go, well, hold on a minute, that's really surface level stuff. I mean, what about the deeper elements? And so this is the idea of life through donating. And the popular commercials, I have this note, the popular commercials that'll make you cry. I'm not going to play these commercials because I don't really want to take up the time, but rest assured, they will make you cry if you watch them. The first commercial is this dog, right, that follows his owner everywhere, his old man, and finally the old man has a heart attack, and the dog races behind the ambulance to the hospital, where the old man goes in, and the dog waits for days outside in the rain and the snow or whatever, and obviously the old man dies in the hospital, and when he comes out, he doesn't come out. In fact, a woman comes out in a wheelchair who has received his heart, the younger lady, and the dog like runs up, paws up on her, right, and recognizes the heart. So this is the idea of an emotional connection here through the heart. Another commercial is this commercial. It's a Korean life insurance commercial where this man every day continues to help the people around him. He moves a pot in the way of the pouring stream of water that he walks through on accident. He helps a woman up on a curb who's carrying a cart of fruits and vegetables. Every day he looks in his wallet and he's only got a couple bucks, but he pulls $1 out and he puts it in this little girl's cup who's on the ground. She's poor. And by the end of the commercial, you're like, what's going on? And then, man, even thinking about it, man, I start like my eyeballs start welling up. But he looks over and the little girl's gone because she's finally in school. And he's so happy, and he sees kind of the idea of what's happening here is he's affecting his community through giving. So this is the idea of legacy work. Perhaps Albert Pike, when he talked about that which we do for others extends into the boundless realms of eternity. So this is one idea of immortality, right? But it's really kind of holistic. Still, nonetheless, amazing work. Ben Franklin, he said, "Fear not death, for the sooner we die, the longer we shall be immortal." He said something else at one point, and I couldn't find the quote, but he said something like, "Fear not mortals, like death is an illusion," or something along those lines. And I found that just, amazing. It made Ben Franklin sound like an alien, or, some kind of interdimensional being. He knew more than he was letting on, perhaps. But getting back to the science, if we take this farther, more than just legacy giving, we have the laws of thermodynamics, which talk about gas, liquids, and solids. So we see this every day. You boil a pot of water, and poof, the water disappears after a while, but it doesn't really go anywhere, right? It evaporates into the air. It's like rain. Rain comes down, fills the pond, liquid, rain goes up, evaporates, back into the cloud, down. It's an endless cycle. And the same thing has happened with matter throughout time. But here's the question, guys. The question is, based on science, anything that has mass can be measured. And if it can be measured, cannot be destroyed because of these laws in thermodynamics. So, the question is, can we measure the soul? Can we, if you want to call the soul consciousness? So some recent studies by 2 psychologists say yes, you can measure the consciousness, and yes, the laws of thermodynamics apply. Really, they talk about entropy. It's Dr. Valerie Hunt, who's a former professor of physiology at UCLA. In a number of her studies, she's found that changes in ambient, subtle electrical and electromagnetic fields that surround us all the time can dramatically affect human cognition and performance. And through this experiment, they can measure the amount of consciousness or soul through a sophisticated process, obviously, that I'm not smart enough for, but the paper was good. However, because of this, it means that your consciousness possibly can't be destroyed. And this again is through entropy. So you exist forever and never cease. This would really be the end of this presentation. However, there's a few more really cool things. So of course what I've done here is really to build an Aristotelian argument for literal apotheosis. So a literal understanding in the real world through demonstrable science, that you really do live forever. What happens to your consciousness next? Does it just go up to the pleroma, or the one field, and do you just stay there now? You're part of the whole, the part of the universe? Or do you stick around as ghosts, or do you do this, or do you do that? Who knows? But the fact is, some part of you must go on. We just don't know where or how yet. And maybe this is because, as David Bohm and others, and Niels Bohr really talked about in their work in physics, was that you can't know because the implicate order doesn't allow you to. It's just one step beyond not the ability to understand it, but there's not a way to understand it through the way we currently work with things. And that's why David Bohm kind of made this shift from physics into philosophy and worked with Krishnamurti for almost 30 years, because he found a real value in exploring those ideas, thinking about physics as more of a biological thing than a mathematical machine. So, but while you're here, while you're listening, maybe we can make it a little bit better. How can we live a little better? How can we help? Yeah, sure, the commercials helps you understand, in intrinsic way, and how to, impact your life and make you feel good now. But what about knowing where we are and how to navigate the rules of the system? This is something I somewhat touched on in the presentation over the last weekend when I talked about the esoteric anatomy of man. One time I was going through probably one of the several emotional crises in my life, as we all do, and I asked my wife, what even is this place? She had a laugh because I said it's so funny. But it was a good place, and it's a good title for the slide. What even is this place? What you're looking at here on the screen is a mathematical representation of what's called the E8 lattice, which basically is a multifaceted crystalline structure with hundreds of vertices, and it's made up of these tetrahedrons, like little shapes, like diamond type shapes, which contain all of existence. And what happens is, what emergent theory tells us is that this E8 lattice is a reflection of something, and it is divided down into a three-dimensional dimension that we live in. And these little tetrahedrons that make up this larger shape are called Planck space, named after the physicist Planck. And Planck spaces are little encapsulations of time. So if you can imagine how much time is in a Planck space, there is a number, and I can't remember it off the top of my head, so I do apologize, but the number is fraction of a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of a second. But in that fraction of a second, it's not like you take a picture and you get a snapshot in what's in field of your camera. It's a snapshot of everything in existence, no matter where in the universe, everything. Imagine a holographic. You go to the mall and you see back in the day when we could go to the mall, you see those like glass things that have like a picture inside of them, and it looks like, your loved one is looking at you from different angles due to the way the laser gets in there. Well, just imagine that snapshot, but everything in the universe contained within one little Planck space, and this whole structure has all of them in there. And because it has all of them in there, there's this idea that actually, well, number one, it backs up the whole idea of entanglement, because it represents this idea of all time already exists. Everything you do, will do, have done is already recorded, and your consciousness just moves through it like a tape. Or like, here, my latest edition of Knight Templar magazine, free plug. This is you move through the book. Each page is a slice in time, and your consciousness moves through it. It's a really amazing, fascinating, and mind-blowing concept. But remember when I said it's a reflection? Thought experiment number 3. A reflection of what? So if it's a reflection, is this like the idea of the play Roma? Is this the idea of maybe the above as below? The left or the right? Like, is it an opposite? Is it pared down? Is it lesser? Who knows? So again, a reflection of maybe light. From where? So again, the Planck space, everything contained in the tetrahedron, all time, immortality, and the tetrahedrons actually adhere to the ratio of 0.618, which is the golden ratio of all things. Masons love this. So understanding a little bit more about quantum entanglement, what Einstein called spooky physics. So in this, to tell you a little bit more about how these things are entangled, how particles are essentially like matched pairs, and if you develop a pair of matched particles and you destroy one, the other one is destroyed. And they don't know how that's happening, but they must be connected, and we don't know how they're connected, which is the entanglement. Right? It's like a ghost string, and we don't know how it works. But what we have figured out is we're doing some amazing things with this today, practical things in information technology. Imagine an email scenario where you have government to government contact, and maybe you have, Tom Cruise is your Mission Impossible spy, and he's got to get this really important email, and he picks up his phone and he goes to open the email, and the second he does, another spy hacks his phone and gets the email first. But before he can read it, instantaneously, the email is destroyed here and from where it came from. So it destroys the email on both sides. This is facts. This is science. We're doing this today, which is just mind-blowing. So again, we know it's real because we're using it. This is the interconnectedness of all things. So regardless of where we send particles, these things tend to, if we destroy one, the other one gets destroyed also. So no presentation on quantum entanglement works unless we talk about the double slit experiment. The double slit experiment looks like this. You have a little electron beam gun. It shoots particles. At first, it shoots the particles through one slit, and they get, on the other side, there's like a screen, and the particles hit the screen. It indents the screen where the particles hit. They put 2 slits. They say, hey, here's what's going to happen. We should see 2 lines. but instead they see what they call an interference pattern, a fancy word for a wave, right? So you see a little, like a light line, a little bit darker, a strong, a little bit lighter, a really light line. So just like that. And they're like, oh, that's really weird that happens. Why does it do that? Let's, instead of firing a ton of electrons through the slit, let's fire just one at a time. And so they do. And same thing starts happening. So then they decide to watch it. So there's no better way to check this out than to watch this terrible rip of Dr. Quantum in the double slit experiment. I'm going to hit play on this, and then I'm going to fast forward it to the 2-minute mark, and it's about 3 minutes long, but I hope you enjoy it. So I'm going to stop share for just a moment so I can reshare with sound.
And here we are, the granddaddy of all quantum weirdness, the infamous double slit experiment. An electron is a tiny, tiny bit of matter, like a tiny marble. Let's fire a stream through one slit. It behaves just like the marble, a single band. So, if we shoot these tiny bits through 2 slits, we should get, like the marbles, 2 bands. What? An interference pattern. We fired electrons, tiny bits of matter through. But we get a pattern like waves, not like little marbles. How? How could pieces of matter create an interference pattern like a wave? It doesn't make sense. But physicists are clever. They thought maybe those little balls are bouncing off each other and creating that pattern. So they decide to shoot electrons through one at a time. There is no way they could interfere with each other. But after an hour of this, the same interference pattern is seen to emerge. The conclusion is inescapable. The single electron leaves as a particle, becomes a wave of potentials, goes through both slits, and interferes with itself to hit the wall like a particle. But mathematically, it's even stranger. It goes through both slits, and it goes through neither. And it goes through just one, and it goes through just the other. All of these possibilities are in superposition with each other. But physicists were completely baffled by this. So they decided to peek and see which slit it actually goes through. They put a measuring device by one slit to see which one it went through and let it fly. But the quantum world is far more mysterious than they could have imagined. When they observed, the electron went back to behaving like a little marble. It produced a pattern of 2 bands, not an interference pattern of many. The very act of measuring or observing which slit it went through meant it only went through one, not both.
All right. So I hope you were able to gather what was happening there. Basically, the act of observation changes the world around you, the manifestation of reality. And so this sounds really weird now, because when you see something, you believe it. Right? This is the mind before matter universe, or matter before mind universe, versus the mind before matter universe argument that Jonathan Black gets into. But it's a really interesting concept that really just says when you view something, you have an influence on it. And that is fascinating. So this is the idea of spooky physics, because we don't know why it does it, and it's spooky. And of course, we've covered the double slit experiment. And so all probabilities exist until we see it or use a consciousness. Thought experiment. On the large scale, if the Big Bang happened, I'm pretty sure it happened because we have the science to show it to us. If the Big Bang happens, and that requires probability or quantum potential, what then viewed the quantum potential to make it happen? So if something has to view it, what viewed it? Or, did a consciousness view it? So here's your next thought experiment. So we covered a few things here, that we are the same age. All matter is created at the Big Bang years ago. All matter is entangled. So we're all connected. And due to the first law, we are all the same age. Fun fact, your body contains a bunch of cells. And over the course of 7 years, about 37.5 trillion cells die and replicate, leaving your consciousness intact to sit at the helm of the machine that these cells, populate around. And is that just due to the fact that you're plugged in to the singular consciousness? So entanglement and practical application is how we know it's real. Like, we've theorized it, we've seen a practical application, we know it's real. So we know that we're all connected somehow. In other words, right, Schrödinger's cat is real. If you're not familiar, Schrödinger, famous philosopher, physicist, basically mathematician, says, you put a cat in a box and you really don't know if it's alive or dead until you look at it. And I guess in this way of thinking about it, it's real. But as we're talking about manifesting reality through thought or observation, it gets into what some might call the hokey idea of the secret or the law of attraction, which actually is probably not so bizarre or hokey, really, in if we look at it in this way, the idea of seeing as believing, or as believing seeing. So if we make a physical observation of atoms moving through a slit, and then it behaves the way we thought, because it's the way we know it should be. But The Secret, the book there, and the Law of Attraction books on this kind of things really talk about the idea that perhaps if you can hack your mind and trick yourself into believing what you saw, then the universe responds by manifesting such a thing. So again, just to recap a little bit on this newest research on consciousness, the consciousness adheres, the idea of measuring it adheres to the laws of thermodynamics. Likely, it is a fundamental force. This is what's fascinating. So this proves the idea of a singular consciousness. There are 4 fundamental forces in the general theory of relativity by Einstein: gravitational, electromagnetic, strong and weak interaction, which are radiation forces. What is said here is there's a new paper out by Golem Kahler and Jordi Farquhar, and there are a couple psychologists, not physicists, who basically say consciousness is like a wave, a 5th fundamental force in the construct of general relativity. And so imagine like a flat wave that reaches down to touch brains, to plug into the single source above. Whether you want to call that the Samadhi Akashic record, the one, the implicate order, flux point, point omega, whatever you want. So again, this now proves the illusion of separation. We are constantly bombarded within Masonry and occult systems the idea of the duality, right? hyper masculine, hyper feminine, divine masculine, divine feminine. You've got to find the equilibrium point. But the fact is that there is really not, there's like constructs or ideas of divine and masculine and feminine forces, but really there is no separation. The duality is an illusion, actually. This image here, just something I put together very quickly to illustrate my point, is the tree that doesn't realize it's connected to the flower. The flower, if it was conscious, might look at the tree and say, oh, doesn't the tree look lovely today? But it should say, don't I look lovely today? And likewise, the tree looking down at the flower might not realize it's part of the same root system. So I don't know why I put that back in there. But anyway, so bringing these together, a silly Venn diagram here, that belief and science can come together to really form reality. You have to believe. If you don't believe, it doesn't work. And the slightest doubt causes the construct to fail. Points to consider: you are scientifically immortal. Your thoughts are directly responsible for manifesting reality through probabilities, through a singular consciousness. A point is that the law of attraction might not really be a self-programming in the way some think, but in reality, a way of influencing the reality around you. Some people say, well, if that's true, why aren't we rich? My teacher basically said, hey, Robert, there are 9 million masters on the planet and probably 8 billion people. These masters really don't have a concern for materialism, so they're not doing that. And they point the way. So when he told me that, I instantly thought of, the tarot card, the hermit who stands on the precipice of a cliff holding the lamp. That's his whole purpose. This way, I'll show you, it's kind of this idea of the divine principle. So science and religion are inseparable. It's a constant thing that John Fetzer, late great John Fetzer, constantly talked about, was in search of his whole life, that these things are inseparable. One concept, 2 or 3 ways to realize, respectively. Ancient wisdom is taught through allegory and mythologies for absorbing and what I call journey thinking. I give you a problem, you think about it, and you work it out. You mull it over. You knead the dough in your head, right? And then you come up with something. Religions, taught through allegory initially, and man has kind of corrupted this and taken things very literally. And science validates some mystical things as facts. I'm sure that there's going to be things where they still, butt heads, but we see one reinforcing the other. And in fact, sometimes ancient wisdom and religions are influencing or the word I'm looking for, when inspiring science to look at certain things. So not to forget those. So you live forever, you can manifest your reality, and you really don't need anything else, right? Your consciousness is maybe not your consciousness, but maybe our consciousness. Alan Watts said, you are the universe experiencing itself, but maybe not. Maybe you are the universe itself. And if you don't believe it, that's okay. It's science. I do have some takeaways from different Masonic texts, but I will not be covering these because I will put these in a citations and bibliography. If you would like to request it, you can check it out. Send me an email, wcypodcast@gmail.com. You'll get a paper that has citations, extra content, those slides I just blazed through, and a peer review survey, which I would love for you to give me, whether you hated it or loved it, and give me points to make everything better. And with that, you can check out my podcast, WCY Podcast, Whence Came You, Sunday nights, 9:30. I hope I didn't bore you to death.
RJ, that was fantastic. I really enjoyed that. One thing that I observed Um, I was having a discussion with a York Right group out of Colorado just the other day, and we were talking about a similar thing about the interconnectedness of man. We didn't really get into the quantum portion of it, but as far as our religion and dogma, the stories that develop, are they allegories for other events or important things in human history? And like you said, if you have a culture that for the most part is illiterate or maybe has no written language at that time, the way you pass on these stories is through oral tradition. So you make up characters and scenarios to explain exactly what happened. And in our 21st century eyes, we see everything so literally rather than the allegory a lot of times they're meant to be. But when we talk about the quantum entanglement, I think, like you said, it really demonstrates what we have known, as men of faith for a very long time, that the relationship between God, man, and everything in the universe is all interconnected. And there are some very strange synchronicities that have happened throughout history. For instance, Alexander Graham Bell filed the patent for the telephone just before another gentleman, and his name escapes me, tried to file his patent. So Alexander Graham Bell is credited as being the father of the telephone simply because he beat the other guy for filing the patent. That's synchronicity. So the idea that there is this universal consciousness and it kind of dips down and touches us, I think there's a lot to that. I don't think it's an accident that things throughout history tend to happen in those weird synchronicities.
Yeah, I mean, if you really look at some of the, they're kind of silly examples, if I'm being honest, but one of my favorites is like when you'll find a movie that comes out one year, and within a week, a similar movie comes out. I'm reminded of maybe the summer of 1994, 95, maybe. Two movies involving volcanoes in Los Angeles came out within a week, right? Just a silly example, but yeah, the synchronicity of events is astounding. But something you said, Matt, really resounds here, and that is like the wisdom of ages. You said, science is now confirming things that men of faith, men and women of faith of all time have known, or through faith. And how do we know that, right? Is faith is kind of this etheric, holistic idea, but really, what if it's deeper than that? What if it's like the last vestigial of a connection you have to the knowledge before you were here, or something along those lines? Like, we just don't know. And my favorite, maybe my favorite part of Indiana Jones, I think it's in the Temple of Doom, right? In the beginning, when Wuhan gets shot and Indiana Jones hold him, and he looks at Indy and he says, I go first. He's so excited to see, the undiscovered country, as it were. But it's just fascinating stuff.
It is fascinating. So, brothers, does anyone have any questions for RJ? If you do, feel free to unmute yourself. And the brothers on Facebook, of course, there's a little bit of a delay, but if you have any questions on Facebook, just type them into the comments, and I'll be happy to ask for you. Hey, Brother Tim, go for it. I think you and Brother Francisco are both sitting in the Millennium Falcon. So, just give each other a high five or something.
I'll defer to Brother Francisco.
Now, if you had a question, Tim, go ahead.
I've got a question, but I've got a series of questions, and I love the presentation, and it could go on for hours, so I'm going to defer to someone else first.
Okay, brother Stephen O'Donnell on Facebook says, "Brother tuning in from Scotland. Tis the wee small hours here. I love that. Is there anywhere one can watch these lectures hosted by Refracted Light during the daytime?" And brother Stephen, what I will tell you is just go to the Refracted Light Facebook page. We also have a Refracted Light YouTube channel, so you can go back and watch most of these presentations there. There are very few exceptions where a presentation is not recorded and posted for later viewing. So knock yourself out. I'd say probably 95% of those presentations are there available for you. But any other questions pertaining to RJ's presentation? Clint.
Hey, RJ. You had a slide up, can we measure the soul? And I know you talked about magnetic fields, electromagnetic fields. Just diving into that, whenever you were talking about measuring the soul, are you talking about the electrical activity that happens throughout the nervous system? Or is this the actual magnetic field that's formed around us, like quote unquote auras, to speak in the old sense?
Yeah, like I said, the old sense, right? There was the whole spiritualist movement that could photograph auras and whatnot. So the paper itself, I would have to refer back to, but from what I remember, it's a combination of the amount of electrical impulses that go into feeding the magnetic field. And then they're looking also, they had like a complex arrangement of equations that brought in things that measured like brainwave activity. And so you ever play with those goofy toys that came out a few years ago, like okay, Tim, you're in the Falcon, so maybe you'll appreciate the Star Wars reference. They had the Star Wars thing where you could test Jedi mind power, right? And it was just a machine that was able to read beta waves. And as you would recite times, like you could sit there and focus all you wanted on raising this ball in this tube, which was just a fan that the more beta waves it read, the more juice went to the fan and blew the ping pong ball up in this tube, right? So it's just a fancy way to measure beta waves. But you could focus all day on it and you couldn't do anything. But the second you started reciting times tables, because this activates beta waves, you'd be like 2, 4, 6, 8, whatever, all of a sudden the fan would, turn on and start raising the ball. And so what they did was they did activities where they were taking those kinds of measurements and feeding them into a complex equation that was giving them, like, for me, it's arbitrary numbers, right? Like 100 or whatever, but they were able to quantify, whole number or integers, levels of how big something was. And that's as best as I can put it, here. And I would have to give you the paper, which I'll when I send the highlight, I'll highlight these two particular pieces within the Google Share document. If you send me an email, I'll highlight them for you so that you can check out the papers. There's psychology papers, so if you're not a psychologist, I'm not. Some of it is more difficult to read, but nothing we can't fix.
Right, very good. Any other questions for RJ? I know Tim, you're dying to ask some questions, but I don't see any other hands or anyone else trying to get RJ's attention. I will say this, Brother Renee, I see you on there, and I know you have a burning question. Okay, maybe not, but Tim, go for it.
Yes, sir. First, RJ, awesome presentation. I'm going to be up late at night for weeks contemplating aspects of this presentation. this is going to get real conspiratorial and controversial. That Last Stand Brown book, they got into quite a bit about noetic sciences, and it caused me to research it a little bit. And there was an aspect on the noetic sciences page that I found where they were doing studies on researching the weight of the soul, because they were looking for quantifiable ways to research it and demonstrate characteristics of it. And one way was through, this was from the Noetic Science website, where they were taking people who had donated their body prior to dying to science, to that specific science, and weighing the weight of the body, and they could find very small finite differences, but yet measurable differences from the weight of the body prior to death and after death. And that was even counting, the weight of the air within the lungs, but they were able to distinguish that the soul seemed to have a weight that they were able to measure.
Yeah, and I briefly touched on that. And what was so interesting is this is Edgar Mitchell, Apollo astronaut. He founded the Institute for Noetic Sciences, and he is a fascinating individual. The experiment that you're talking about, what made it groundbreaking was they took into account what a lot of other tests and the sort did not take into account, like what you mentioned, the weight of the air and lungs. Everything is a weight. The first measurements, the things that gave root to the study of thermodynamics and what we see in energy conversions or whatever to different states of matter, were done. Shame on me. It's a French dude. And he basically said, like, if you put a glass sphere around Paris, for instance, and you took that sphere out, and the city and the dirt and the buildings, everything was in it, and you weighed it, quote unquote, arbitrary number, it weighs 100. Now, let's say within the closed system, you burn it all to the ground, and it's no longer there. Yet it still weighs the same when you take into account the gas that's in there as well. So,
Le Chatelier.
What's that?
Le Chatelier. Le Chatelier's principle.
Yep, you got it. Thank you, Parth. You're the man. So using that, the Noetic Sciences Institute was like their claim to, like, look, we did the real science. We calculated this stuff and we took it into account. But of course, I hate saying mainstream anything because it makes me feel like I should be on Alex Jones Fighting Globalists or something. But so mainstream science typically looks at that and they say, oh, but you didn't do this. And then they consider, the results some sort of what they would call dubious or, not as controlled as they would have liked. But, conspiratorial to your point, Tim, is that what they want? To what end? I don't know, but you can make a case for it.
All right. Any other questions for worshipful brother RJ?
I've got a ton of questions, but they would probably not promote noble science that he's promoting, and so I'll wait till we stop recording to ask him.
Okay. And any questions from Facebook? Brother Stephen O'Donnell asked, what the weight of an electromagnet would the weight of an electromagnet weigh the same whether it's switched on or off? I have no clue.
I may have an answer for that one.
Okay.
Yeah, hit it.
So I think what he's referencing is what we talked about, the electromagnetic field around the human body. Does that have a weight to it like an electromagnet? If it's on, does it weigh more or less than whenever it's off? And the answer to that would be that is completely relative to what it's around because it's a magnet. So a magnet's going to weigh more if the scale you're weighing it with is made of metal, because you're going to have more applied force to that object. But if you had a way of weighing it without actually touching it or observing it properly so it wouldn't affect the measurement outcome, I don't think it would, just because the electricity is measured differently than weight. It's measured in joules or actual, electrical current.
You were the man to ask. Thank you, Clinton. That was awesome.
Clint, thank God you were here. That's awesome.
Thanks, I guess.
I kind of want to spoil that.
Go for it, Tim.
What you got, Tim?
Like, if a scale measures things in weights, right? It doesn't that scale does not necessarily have to be made out of metal. Like you could 3D print, plastics, which the scale in itself, after you printed it, would still have a weight to it, but it would not necessarily have a magnetic current, and it wouldn't actually have to be made out of metal.
You're right. I was using the metal scale as an analogy that a professor used one time whenever we were determining currents and electricity through electromagnetic forces throughout the Earth's atmosphere.
So I don't know if like a scale made out of synthetic non-magnetic materials would even apply to that situation or not, but maybe I'm drunk too.
Just a theory on it. Where does the electricity come from that's running the electromagnetic magnet? That would be a real question, because if anything that is added to it is going to add maybe not weight, but general mass of the object. So there again, it depends on how you're measuring the quote unquote weight of it. If the electricity is formed from the object, like an alternator or a generator, it's still using force to do that. And we know that a generator works by spinning around in a circle, and you've got magnets on the outside. Well, it uses centrifugal force to create that. So that's going to apply an outward force of pressure throughout the entirety of the object. So that will increase the felt weight of it, but not the overall mass weight.
Right, and a scale made out of non-metallic materials theoretically could measure those weights. It would not necessarily have to be metallic in nature to do so. Right.
Yeah, you're right. I was quoting a professor whenever I said that. It was kind of a like RJ said earlier, a thought experiment.
Right.
Was how would you go about measuring something that inertly just reacts to everything else in its environment? How would you go around testing that?
It would be kind of like the microradian measurement scales that, it calculated characteristics rather than weight, or to determine characteristics rather than weight, conceptually.
Right.
I didn't say that to be a smart ass at all, but rather just...
No, I'll take a midichlorian reference any day.
Yeah, I mean, because you could take those characteristics and they each have known weights. I've got a few more comments or ideas, but I'll defer until later.
Okay.
Matt, I did have one thing. I ran out of the room a second ago. There was a book I've been trying to think of this entire presentation, and it wouldn't come to me, and I finally found it. I was going to ask RJ if he's read The Physics of God.
No. Was it Joseph? Who is it? Joseph
Selby?
Selby, yeah.
No.
On the front cover, it says Unifying Quantum Physics, Consciousness, M-Theory, Heaven, Neuroscience, and Transcendence.
Oh, well.
I feel like this might be up your alley.
I think he wrote the book I was trying to write, maybe. That's awesome. Yeah, I'm going to check it out.
You guys are all making my head hurt. I had no idea you guys were that smart. But this is, and you know, most of you have probably read this. I don't know. This is Bill Bryson's book, A Short History of Nearly Everything. And it's more, it's a natural history. And it's better in audio. But really a fascinating look at it. You know, he takes everything on kind of an arc from the smallest particle. He starts out with the smallest particles and ancient in time, and takes everything up to the largest known objects, the largest known particles, etc., and then back down to the smallest. Really a pretty neat study, and just a very entertaining approach to natural history. But RJ, Bill Bryson talks about that. The quandary there of because your cells, because we shed so many of our cells, yet don't other than like our diseases of the brain and things that we're familiar with, but we don't change who we are. I think he's got an interesting discussion of whether in the Star Trek model, when you get beamed up, would you be the same person? And he uses that in part of his discussion of why we stay who we are when our cells are constantly turning over, and how that's kind of an area where scientists, at least in the past, it was one of those things where scientists had to kind of look away and just say, hey, we don't know, we don't understand that.
That's exactly what Niels Bohr said. So we see Niels Bohr kind of says, look away from it. And later on, basically, David Bohm says, well, hold on a minute. We should look at these things called hidden variables. But the science world said, we're not going to pay attention to you anymore because you were connected to the Communist Party for a minute and we kicked you out of America. So, but he does the same thing. He says, maybe we should look at those things. And then later on, when I mentioned this in the presentation over the weekend, but really a lot of what I talk about, not a lot, maybe, a few points here, but Infinite Potential is a film they released on YouTube, and it's about the life of David Bohm, and it's produced by the Fetzer Institute, who a lot of you are familiar with Masonic Legacy Society, which is centered around some of the great things that were of interest to John Fetzer of the Fetzer Institute. So it is really interesting that those things are tied together. But in the documentary, they show finally a visualization of the double slit experiment of particles going through the slits, and they show they've been able to animate the underlying data that shows the quantum potential wave. And it's like the most beautiful thing you ever saw, because it's basically like the finger of God, right? It's like, oh my God, we're not supposed to see this, but here we are visualizing it, based on the observable data we have. And it's absolutely fascinating. A similar book to what you're talking about, but probably not as cool as that one actually is, Dan Borstein's book. I turned around. It's called The Discoveries or The Discoverers. But that's another fantastic book. The front first page is a line from King Lear. and it's and look upon the thing. Oh, you have like, there you go. Yeah, a wonderful wonderful book. The forward in there is from of the thing. Oh wow, yeah, you got those. Those are truly some of a couple favorite books. The King Lear quote is to examine things as like, you're spies on God or God's spies, to examine those hidden things. And it's really remarkable. Something you also said about how you kind of don't change, pending, diseases of the brain. And so the brain acts as like the central processing unit to like take in through your five senses the experiences that you have, and they filter up through the brain, which maybe has this link to the consciousness, which goes up there and informs the consciousness, and then a refined experience comes down to you, and you manifest a reality out from there, kind of like an endless, like a feedback loop, customer satisfaction survey type deal. Forgive the analogy, but what you said was interesting, because I remember watching this. It was like a Dateline thing many years ago. This dude was in a car accident and damaged the frontal lobe. And after that, he was literally, he's the same person. He knows everything, but he was different. Like, he had a different taste of music, couldn't play guitar anymore, couldn't do this anymore, and everything was different. And so then my question was like, well, that's really strange. What happened? If we do have that connection, is the connection broken? Is it synapse changed? Like, what flipped? And pending that unique biological form, like, what changed to filter things through to completely change the way people act or whatever? Like, it makes a case that the knowledge doesn't change, but how you are, physically and mentally do, is truly unique and totally bizarre.
All right. That was fantastic. And I do want to give a special thank you to Brother Stephen O'Donnell, who is over in Scotland. So it's very, very early in the morning there, but he made the sacrifice to be here for your presentation tonight, RJ. And so we're really honored to have Brother Stephen with us.
Thank you so much, Brother Stephen. That's so cool. Thank you.
Yeah. So, Brother Stephen, I will be expecting that case of Scotch whiskey any day now. That'll be fine. But, brothers, any other last questions for RJ? And RJ, I know it's getting kind of late, but I do have one question, if you don't mind. You alluded to or mentioned earlier in your presentation OBEs, or out-of-body experiences, and I think near-death experiences are, certainly fall into that category. And you have some perspective on that, and I was wondering if you would share your perspective on that, and how that really ties into that universal consciousness.
Yeah. Well, I think my unique experience with OBE is not as maybe unique as some. When I probably had like my first OBE when I was like 5 or 6 years old that I remember, but maybe it wasn't. Maybe I was, just coming out of a dream or something. But I just remember I saw myself, and then like a flash, I could see me sleeping. And that was really bizarre. And then there were some other instances, but now my experience with it is largely based in a meditative practice, and for me, it's like you reach a state. Sometimes it takes a while, sometimes it doesn't. A while could mean like 5 minutes, or it could be like 30 minutes. Some people, it takes them a few hours or whatever. I'm lucky or whatever. Mine is kind of tonal. So like I'll hear a tone and then a snap pop, and it's just like kind of out. But what I think is interesting about it and how it kind of relates to the interconnectedness is that I don't know that it would be possible to do something or to see something outside of a physical vessel or like be conscious of it if the perception hadn't already been like perceived by everything else. It's hard to describe, but I think it leads to the credible idea of a interconnectedness, just by the way that you could possibly see, or maybe you're not seeing. Maybe you're experiencing, and then you're seeing because it's. Was it Heisenberg? Werner Heisenberg said something along the lines of, "You can't." We measure things. And we observe things, or we measure things based on how we observe them. So we can't observe anything or measure them through methods that aren't understood by the human consciousness, right? And in a last bit on OBEs or whatever, go on and find videos of Skip Atwater talking about remote viewing. It's fantastic, but check that stuff out.
Hey, I want to comment real quick on what RJ just said. 3 days ago, the CIA released all the documents from the 1980s experiments, and the CIA of the United States government confirmed astral projection and remote viewing did take place in 1983, 1985, and 1987 on multiple occasions. So the movie Men Who Stare at Goats is now a documentary. So that's weird.
Yeah, that's some legit stuff. Skip Atwater ran the program for years. When it was first called Project Flame Grill, and then after that it was Project Stargate. And basically Hal Puthoff in 1979 gave little bits of information to Skip Atwater and said, "Hey, have your remote viewers check this out sometime." And he said, "Okay," but then didn't. And the general rule is the person doing the interviewing of somebody who's doing a remote viewer, they would say, "Here's some coordinates. What do you see?" And then those persons write it all down. And there's never confirmation. So those people viewing never get confirmation on what they saw. And so somebody in the audience, this particular thing, Hal Puthoff had given coordinates that were supposed to be, I'm going to get controversial and weird, alien bases on Earth. And basically, Skip Atwater had assigned these things to these remote viewers, and they described everything, and it's really bizarre. And somebody in the audience said, "So you got the results of what they said, which aligned perfectly with what Hal Puthoff said that they would see, based on the coordinates. When did they ever get confirmation?" And so this happens in like 1985, and Skip Atwater is talking in 2006, and he says, "What's today's date?" Meaning they got confirmation right now that this was legit. So there's something to it. Yeah. I mean, it's, the U.S. Army did it. They said they did it. They're probably still doing it, although probably more refined. And I doubt we'll ever really, know.
All right, fantastic. So we have established that The Men That Stare at Goats is a documentary, which I don't think that was really much of a secret. The Pentagon releasing that, or the government releasing that information. I think we all knew that, but I mean, it's great that they finally acknowledged that publicly. But I think it just further proves what we've been discussing this evening, that things are so interconnected, even with out-of-body experiences, with remote viewing. There's this universal consciousness that's really undeniable, and we're all part of that matrix that makes it up. So that begs the question, do we all have those innate powers or abilities to connect in ways that maybe we really haven't tapped into yet? So one last round. Any other questions for Brother RJ? Okay, hearing none. RJ, again, that was a brilliant presentation, and you've given your entire quantum series here, all 3 parts, and this really did sum up the entire thing quite nicely. So what I will do is repost all 3 videos on refracted light so that anyone can watch them consecutively and see how they all link together and ultimately come together in this final presentation. Again, I'm just blown away. I'm looking forward to going back and rewatching it myself, but I've really, really enjoyed it. So, RJ, thank you again. Really appreciate you, giving up your time to be here with us this evening again, and just as always, delivering a brilliant, brilliant presentation.
Thanks so much.